Canada holds 20% of the world's fresh water, more than any other country on Earth. For decades, the United States has quietly pushed for access to that water.
Millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down.
And for decades, Canada said nothing clear enough to settle the question. But Prime Minister Mark Carney just broke that silence, and he didn't leave any room for interpretation. Canadian fresh water is not for sale. Not now, not ever. So what exactly did Carney announce, and why is it sending shockwaves through Washington? Last week, the Canadian government launched what it calls the Force of Nature Strategy, a sweeping $3.8 billion plan to protect Canada's lands, waters, and natural ecosystems.
$3.8 billion of new funds, protecting nature, building Canada well, and valuing nature and mobilizing capital.
On the surface, it looked like a conservation announcement, but buried inside it was a message directed squarely at the United States.
Canada is home to 20% of the world's fresh water, 25% of the world's wetlands.
Carney's government confirmed that Canadian fresh water is completely excluded from any trade negotiations or resource sharing agreements with Washington. The strategy commits to protecting 30% of Canada's lands and waters by the year 2030.
We and others committed to one of the world's biggest conservation goals, protecting 30% of our lands and waters by the end of this decade.
It creates new national parks, new marine conservation areas, and new federal protections for some of the most water-rich regions on the continent. Once those protections are formally in place, those resources are locked behind Canadian conservation law. That means no trade deal, no matter how much economic or political pressure Washington applies, can legally touch them. This was not just an environmental announcement, it was a sovereignty statement, and Ottawa knew exactly what it was doing. The scale of what Canada is now protecting is difficult to overstate. Canada contains 25% of the world's wetlands and nearly a quarter of its boreal forests.
25% of the world's wetlands, almost a quarter of the world's boreal forests, more than 80,000 species, from the iconic polar bears, beavers, Canada geese, to the unique eastern wolf, Vancouver Island marmot, and the Perry caribou.
These are not just scenic landscapes or tourist destinations. They are the living systems that generate, store, and filter fresh water at a truly continental scale. Remove them, and the water cycle that feeds rivers, lakes, and aquifers across North America begins to break down. One of the most significant moves in the announcement is the protection of the Seal River watershed in Manitoba. This is the world's largest intact watershed, a vast, unbroken system of rivers, wetlands, and forests. It will now become a national park, permanently shielded from any commercial or industrial use. Before this strategy, Canada protected roughly 14% of its land.
We'll create new national parks and marine conservation sites, new national urban parks, so-called other effective area-based conservation measures, which are sites where the land and water can be conserved while allowing some other activities.
The new plan adds another 16%, bringing the total to the full 30% target by 2030. That puts an enormous share of the continent's most valuable water resources entirely beyond the reach of any future trade negotiation. And the economic argument is already built in. Parks Canada sites alone contribute over $4 billion to Canada's GDP and support 37,000 jobs. Carney is framing conservation as economic strength, not political sacrifice. But the real story is just beginning. This tension between the United States and Canada over water is not new, and it did not start with Trump. As far back as the 1980s, American proposals to divert Great Lakes water southward were already circulating in Washington. Canada blocked those efforts through bilateral agreements, but the underlying pressure never fully disappeared. When Donald Trump returned to the White House for a second term, resource nationalism came back with him, louder and more direct than before. Trump made public statements suggesting that Canadian energy, land, and water could all be used as leverage in broader trade disputes. The pressure was no longer subtle or deniable. Canada had also signed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in 2022, committing to the 30 by 30 conservation target alongside nearly 200 other nations. That international commitment handed Carney's government something powerful to work with. Canada was not just saying no to Washington on its own, it was pointing to a binding promise already made to the world. The consequences of this announcement extend well beyond environmental policy. For the United States, Carney's move removes a significant long-term negotiating option. Any future trade deal between the two countries cannot legally include Canadian freshwater access once the conservation protections are fully in place. That closes a door Washington has kept open and quietly relied on for decades. For Canadians, the effects are more immediate and more personal. Protecting watersheds like the Seal River directly safeguards drinking water supplies, reduces flood risk across vulnerable communities, and upholds Indigenous land rights in regions where those rights have historically been ignored. The announcement also extended Canada's Ghost Gear Fund, which has already removed over 2,500 tonnes of abandoned and discarded fishing equipment from Canadian waters since 2020.
Which has already removed over 2,500 tonnes of fishing equipment from Canada's waters since 2020.
Up to 14 new marine protected areas were confirmed, along with 10 new national marine conservation areas, including 2 in the Arctic. Canada is not only protecting its inland water, it is systematically locking down its oceanic resources as well, and this is where the situation becomes more complicated. Here is the part that most political commentators have missed entirely. Carney never framed this as a response to Trump. He never mentioned Washington by name. He framed it entirely as a climate and biodiversity policy tied to Canada's international conservation commitments. By doing that, he avoided a confrontation while achieving the same result. Washington cannot easily argue against an internationally backed conservation framework without looking like it opposes global environmental agreements, and Carney did not stop there. He brought Bay Street into the room. The third pillar of the Force of Nature strategy is called mobilizing capital. That means private investors, Canadian financial institutions, and Bay Street firms are being actively recruited to fund conservation projects across the country. This detail is easy to overlook, but it may be the most strategically significant part of the entire announcement. Mark Carney spent years as Governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. He understands one thing about politics that most politicians do not fully grasp. Political promises can be reversed by the next election. Financial structures are far harder to undo. By attaching private capital to conservation, Carney is creating economic incentives that outlast any single government or any single trade negotiation. If Bay Street is profiting from protecting the Seal River watershed, the next Canadian government, regardless of which party wins, faces serious financial and legal consequences if it tries to reverse those protections or open those resources to outside negotiation. This is a sovereign resource policy dressed as environmentalism. It uses 3 separate layers of protection simultaneously: international law, domestic conservation frameworks, and private financial interests. Together, those 3 layers are extremely difficult to dismantle. Canada's 30i30 commitment reinforces all of this. Because it was made at a United Nations conference, it now politically and legally binds future Canadian governments. Walking it back would require withdrawing from an international agreement signed alongside nearly 200 countries, a move that would carry enormous diplomatic consequences. Carney is not simply saying no to Trump. He is building a structure that makes it very difficult for anyone, including future Canadian leaders, to ever say yes. Mark Carney has drawn a line that no Canadian Prime Minister has drawn this clearly before. Fresh water is a national asset, not a commodity, not a bargaining chip, not something to be placed on a trade negotiating table. And Canadian conservation law, backed by international agreements and private capital, is now its permanent guardian. As climate change accelerates and global water scarcity deepens in the decades ahead, that decision may prove to be the most consequential resource policy Canada has made in a generation. The question worth sitting with is this: if fresh water becomes the defining resource of the 21st century, what happens when the country that holds the most of it says no?